You've read in your text about Apollo and about the many stories of his amours and his birth and the oracle at Delphi. And of course, we saw Apollo in the Oresteia, in that remarkable role that he had of first giving Orestes the instructions that he had to take vengeance on his mother Clytemnestra, then purifying him at Delphi, and that, of course, was a major function of Apollo, to be able to purify people when it was appropriate, that they not carry around the pollution for murder, for bloodshed. And we see him as a vehement advocate against the old guard, the Furies, who simply want to exact simple vengeance. So he does rather appear there as a kind of apostle of the light, of reason, of judicious behavior. And that, of course, is one of the major manifestations of the god. But I want to talk today a little bit about some of the other characteristics that the Greek recognized in their figure of Apollo, and hence I've titled this unit Light and Darkness. In this statue, it's a Roman copy of a 4th century BCE statue of Apollo. It's called the Belvedere because of its particular courtyard in the Vatican Palace where it now stands. It rather shows all of those features that we typically think of with Apollo: his beauty, his confidence, his poise, the striding god, a god who looks out with a clear gaze into the future. In some ways, he seems to be the epitome of the Greek god, one who is a figure of light, and indeed, even in antiquity, Apollo is sometimes melded together with Helios, the god of the sun. One of his epithets is Phoebus, which means bright or shining. His parentage, which is discussed in detail in the Morford and Lenardon text, is that he was the son of Leto and Zeus, Leto being of the older generations of the gods. Hera, ever jealous of her husband's amours, harries and harasses poor pregnant Leto all over the world, not threatening any place that wants to give her shelter for the birth. Finally, the formerly floating island of Asteria provides a place for her, and in return, Poseidon anchors it into the ocean's floor so it becomes a fixed place. And there she gives birth to both Apollo and his sister Artemis. And here you can see a photo of a procession way with lions that were set up somewhere around 600 BCE in honor of Apollo. The whole island of Delos is a sacred spot, was a sacred spot in the ancient world. Today it's a sacred archaeological site. Visitors can come during the day, but they can't stay on the island. It's entirely dedicated to the upkeep of these extraordinary archaeological monuments. Although, as we've already discussed, he seems to be the most Greek of the gods, the quintessence of Olympian deities. The fact is that there's no evidence of that name in Linear B. That's not determinative that he wasn't a Greek god, but it really looks like he's a kind of an import. There are twin theories, which your book discusses, some having elements of the figure coming from Asia, others coming from the far north. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. There are cult sites of Apollo already in deep antiquity by 700 BCE. And he has many, many different aspects to his particular persona. He is the healer, but he's also the bringer of disease. As you might remember from the beginning of the Iliad, he brings the plague on against the Greek forces. He's a god of music. He's the god of prophecy, one who can predict the future, and through his oracle at Delphi can share, usually in a very riddling form, what the future will be for those who come and ask. He's a god of archery, in that regard, much like his sister. He can purify those who deserve to be purified of the miasma of bloodshed. He's a lawgiver, credited in particular with the giving of the Spartan constitution. And he has many wonderful sayings, Meden agan, nothing in excess, and Gnothi seauton, know yourself, hate hubris, observe the limit. It's an interesting thing how many Greek names have at their stem Apollo, Apollodorus, Apollonius, and using one of his epithets, Pythagoras from the Pythian epithet. The oracle at Delphi deserves special attention because it really was a major center of the Greek world and Greek culture. In it sat the Pythian priestess, and there's all kinds of legend and history around her. She would go into some kind of manic state. Some have argued that there was a crack in the earth that let up vapors that would put her into such a state. Much more likely, of course, is what E.R. Dodds has argued, that this was a genuine phenomenon of going into a trance, as some people are able to do. And then there would be assistants who would write down the things that she uttered, which would typically be in a very riddlesome and difficult form to understand. Often deliberately ambiguous, Herodotus tells the story that Croesus, the king of Lydia, sent to Apollo and asked, should I attack Persia? To which the oracle responded, if you do, a great empire will fall. And poor Croesus thought, that means I'm going to succeed. In fact, it was his own empire that was about to fall. That's rather typical of the way that the oracle would give quite ambiguous advice. But in some senses, it appears that it had a political agenda, and some ancient historians have argued that it played a role in the toppling of the tyrannies and their replacement with freer forms of government. And here you can see the truly magnificent setting of the oracle at Delphi. The many temples and treasuries set up in honor of this spot so sacred to Apollo. It was the site of the second most important set of Greek games, the Pythian festival held every 4 years. And indeed, the poet Pindar, who writes odes in praise of the athletic victors, has a series of Pythian odes. Unearthed at Delphi are many magnificent statues. This one of a charioteer, obviously a place where there were such important athletic games, would have victory monuments set up. This is a wonderful piece of sculpture from the past. Typically, bronze statues come to a bad fate of getting melted down. It's wonderful that this thing has survived. Apollo, although he might be seen as an apostle of light and reason, is rather a destructive figure in his love life. He is smitten by the beautiful Coronis and has a sexual liaison with her, but she also becomes interested in another person, and when Apollo discovers this, he's torn with jealousy and he kills her with an arrow. But he realizes that she's pregnant, so he snatches from her womb Asclepius, who will grow up to be the god of healing. And hence we see once again, the reinforcement of Apollo's role as a god of medicine. But poor Coronis dies in this episode. And you've already read, of course, about Cassandra in the Oresteia. He gave her the gift of prophecy, but when she refused to consummate their liaison, he humiliated her by ensuring that she would never be believed. And remember those haunting passages in the Agamemnon when she screams out how Apollo has destroyed her, knowing that when she enters the house of Atreus, it will be to her death at the hand of Clytemnestra. He's smitten with a love for the beautiful boy Hyacinthus, but throwing the discus, Hyacinthus is in the path of the discus and he's killed. He attempts to rape Daphne, and we're going to see some sculpture and illustration and art of this episode. She flees, and her father, a river god, helps her transform metamorphosis into the laurel tree, which becomes the sacred tree of Apollo. He has a liaison with Hecuba, otherwise the wife of Priam, and the son of that union is Troilus, who is slain by Achilles. This carving by the Italian sculptor Bernini captures the horror, the fear of Daphne and her transformation into the laurel tree. The brutality of the god is evident in this episode, and Bernini has captured that moment of the fearful Daphne desperately trying to escape his clutches. At the beginning of the semester, I talked with you about the ongoing process of mythopoiesis, the making of myth, and pointed out the fact that it really is a mistake to think of a canonical, a single version of a myth, because the process was ongoing in antiquity. And I've asked you, as your assignment on the discussion board, to take a careful look and interpret this scene by the postmodernist artist Milet Andrejevic in a retelling, I should say, a revisualization of the story of Daphne and Apollo. And I'll leave this to your interpretive creativity. What I want to stress is we own the myths. They don't have to end the way they did in any retelling. And particularly, I want you to contrast the vision of Apollo and Daphne that you saw in the sculpture of Bernini and what Milet Andrejevic did many centuries later. I mentioned a moment ago Pythagoras, and note that name, Pythagoras, just like the Pythian priestess, this taking up one of the roles of Apollo. The Pythia, remember, the Pythian priestess, is the one who is able to channel the inspiration of the god and give the prophecy, in other words, the vision into the future. And of course, we also have to mention that it was here at this site that Apollo slew the archetypal monster, the Python, and actually had to undergo purification for that. So that stem that we see in Pythagoras is extremely important, links him with the cult of Apollo. He was reputed to be the son of Apollo, or even Apollo Hyperboreus, Apollo from the land of the Hyperboreans. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. And as you know from your Algebra 1, or I guess it's Algebra 1, or maybe it's Algebra 2, the Pythagorean theorem evokes the genius of Pythagoras as a mathematician. And that he is linked as well to his grasp of musical harmony. All of these things touching base with the rational vision of Apollo, who plays the harp so beautifully, who is the god of reason. One of the important parts of the cult of Pythagoras was the belief in the transmigration of souls, or metempsychosis, that a soul could move from one person to another. And this will be a really important part of understanding the darker side of Apollo, not just the god of light, but also one who has powers that are really quite unworldly, that take us beyond the normal borders of existence. The Pythagoreans had strict religious rules. There was a great order about the cult. And that, of course, is one of the other aspects, remember, of Apollo. So much a god of order, nothing in excess, hate hubris. And hence in the Pythagoreans we see this kind of strong self-discipline. We're very soon going to be studying the god Dionysus, but one thing that should already be evident is that Dionysus seems to be the opposite of Apollo. Dionysus, who is so linked to ecstasy, to going out of a normal state of existence, to drunkenness, to the theater where people play roles that are different from their normal existence as people. Dionysus, whose cult involves the wearing of animal skins and going off into the wilds and having Bacchic festivals. This just doesn't seem to be Apollo. But here's where the Greeks are so very, very insightful in seeing that there are multiple aspects to existence, whether it's of gods or of humankind. One of the things we see in the legends about Apollo is a connection with various miracle workers, those who have out-of-body experiences. The figure of Aristeas, he falls into a death-like state, but he revives. Here's what Herodotus, sometimes called the father of history, had to say. And I will tell a tale which I heard about him, that's Aristeas, in Proconesus and Cyzicus. They say that Aristeas, who was in birth inferior to none of the citizens, entered a fuller's shop in Proconesus, and there died. And the fuller closed his workshop and went away to report the matter to the relations of the dead man. And when the news had already been spread abroad through the city that Aristeas was dead, a man of Cyzicus, who had come from the town of Artace, entered into the controversy with those who'd said so, declaring that he had met him going towards Cyzicus, and had spoken with him. While he was vehemently in dispute, the relations of the dead man came to the fuller's shop with the things proper in order to take up the corpse for burial. And when the house was opened, Aristeas was not found there either dead or alive. In the 7th year after this, he appeared at Proconesus and composed those verses which are called by the Hellenes the Arimaspeia. And having composed them, he disappeared a second time. Well, it goes on in that vein. Another one of these wondrous figures named Abaris has a connection with the Hyperboreans. Who are the Hyperboreans? These are the people who are said to live beyond the north wind, in some area of the world beyond the normal borders. And there they say that Apollo goes every year to spend time in the with the Hyperboreans. In other words, that he transcends the normal borders of the world. This is leading me to an important point which W.K.C. Guthrie makes, namely that there are elements of the cult of the shaman involved in the development of the Apollo figure. Remember that the shamans are these figures who can go into trances. These people actually do exist. I had a student in one of my classes from Mongolia who reported that as a child he watched shamans going into their trances, and the idea was that they could go to this other world and they could positively affect the animal supply and do other things that couldn't be done in normal human existence. So the idea of the trance-like state, which remember is something that the Pythian priestess goes into in order to be the vehicle for the prophecies of Apollo, and Apollo himself going to this region beyond the borders of the world. Plutarch tells us that Dionysus, this god of ecstasy, the god of transgressing borders of all various types, was at home in Delphi no less than Apollo. In other words, these two figures are to some degree overlapping. Picture a Venn diagram where there's some common ground between them. Guthrie says if Apollo succeeded to some extent in taking Dionysus, Dionysus in his turn imparted a measure of his ecstasy to the Pythia. And Aeschylus, in a fragment, we don't have the rest of the play, has the phrase, the Ivied, the Bacchic, the prophet, all of these things coming together. Euripides invokes Lord Bacchus, lover of the bay being the laurel tree, which is the tree sacred to Apollo. Paeon, Apollo of the tuneful lyre. He takes the two of them together, the god of music and Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, who is described here as the lover of the tree that's sacred to Apollo. One of the invocations of the person who sought purification would be, help me, Apollo, for thou too. In other words, Apollo was able to connect with mortals because he himself had been in this state of pollution. So what do we draw from this? We draw from a uniquely Greek insight, which is that figures are able to blend the world of the rational with the irrational, that not everything that is going to be worked out in pure mathematical precision will give us the complete picture. What's also necessary is that ability to be inspired, to go beyond the normal borders and the normal boundaries. And that's what makes the historical figure, historical in the sense of the god that the Greeks in historical times knew, the god Apollo, who could be in those worlds at the same time, both the god of light and the god who can live in the shadows, transgressing the normal boundaries and thereby bringing back inspiration and insight that otherwise could not be had.